Hello class, and welcome to your chapter 13 lecture, where today we're going to talk about juvenile gangs. The learning objectives for this lesson are that by the end, you should be able to define gangs, outline the development of gangs in the US, describe the behaviors and activities of gangs, identify the primary types of gangs, as well as identify the 7 stages of emergent gang development, and summarize efforts to prevent and control gangs. So Fred Bobby Gore said that if we want to deal with youth crime, adult crime, and street gangs, we have to go back to the family unit. We must improve our schools, and we must make our neighborhoods more desirable, and we must provide alternatives to gangs and drugs. So most youth gangs surged in the late 1980s in the US and used the names of national urban gangs, while others made up their own based on their neighborhoods or images that they wanted to depict. So through 2009, the number of youth in gangs and the number of gangs actually increased to about 28,100 gangs with over 731,000 members. So it shows you there's a lot of people out there looking for belonging, looking for protection. So what is the actual definition of a gang? Well, it's just an association of 3 or more members. They have to adopt a group identity that creates an atmosphere typically of fear and intimidation. They have to engage in criminal activity or engaging in juvenile delinquency. And their purpose is to enhance or preserve the association's power, reputation, or their economic resources. So some characteristics you see are that they have rules for joining, they meet on a reoccurring basis, they'll provide maybe physical protection, or they have control over a certain area or region, and they typically have an identifiable structure. So let's look at the development of gangs over the years briefly. So in the early 1800s, we had youth gangs spreading in New England, and this was really as a result from an agrarian to an industrial society. So these gangs flourished in large cities as immigration and population shifts reached really record levels. And primarily you had those of Irish, Jewish, and Italian descent in these youth gangs in the early 1800s. From the 1920s to the 1940s, you then had this idea from Frederick Thatcher that gangs are really just a normal part of growing up. And they were formed because these youth either went to school or they played together, and then they were able to develop really just this strong sense of identity. So here we're seeing some youth gangs where you would have sort of this idea of you have your leaders and your lieutenants at the core. They then have some rank and file membership where they really answer directly to the leaders, and then you have drifters, kids who are just coming in and out who don't actually maybe stay part of that gang. In the 1950s, we then saw sort of this West Side Story era of youth gangs where these youth were spending time hanging out and partying. They may be fighting other gangs, and the programs that were developed to prevent and control gang behavior, one of them being the detached workers program. So this is where we actually sent professionals into the community to work with the youth gangs. But unfortunately, they actually had little or no positive effect on reducing delinquent activity and actually ended up increasing the size of youth gangs and the commitment of youth to gangs. So it did the complete opposite of what they intended to do. In the 1960s, we saw super gangs starting to develop. So these are your Vice Lords, your Blackstone Rangers, your Crips, your Bloods, names you're more familiar with. So when we talk about youth gangs, they really started becoming involved in social betterment programs, and they were participating in really political activism. So we had Operation Bootstrap, which was the Vice Lords and Blackstone Rangers, where they formed committees for education, recreation, law and order, and even justice. And then you had the 1967 Rockefeller Foundation grant, where the Vice Lords actually hosted economic and social ventures for the communities. Finally, you had Operation Breadbasket, which is where the Vice Lords teamed up with Jesse Jackson and the Coalition for United Community Action to protest a lack of African American employees on construction sites, specifically in African American neighborhoods. So they were doing a lot of political activism here. Then in the 1970s to the 1990s, we saw gang composition be made up of more adults. And we unfortunately know that street gangs are the ones that are responsible really for a large portion of our urban and violent crime when we look at things like drug trafficking and robberies. Gangs also met the needs that individuals just couldn't obtain through social groups or traditional rites of passage. So they were trying to find a sense of love and belonging somewhere, and they found it within these gangs. We also saw an increased imprisonment of gang members, which unfortunately fostered prison gangs inside of the facilities. And then there was really just this intent to make money and this competition over drug trades that we saw coming about. So now we're moving away from the idea of social betterment and political activism and more towards what can I do for the gang and what can the gang do for me. So the typical profiles of gang members, when we talk about their age, typically around the age of 14 to 30% of adolescents will join a gang at some point, where we have 70% of all gang members being from the small communities are actually juveniles. And we've even seen youth as young as 8 years of age joining gangs. And the gangs will actually use youth because they think that they're protected from the harsh realities of the adult system. But we know that there are methods by which a juvenile can be transferred to the adult system. Though I will say typically juveniles are going to get off a little bit easier than the adults would, which is why they use the youth to really do a lot of their running for them. When we look at size, your traditional or territorial gangs are typically made up of maybe 150 members. And then your drug trafficking gangs tend to be a little bit smaller at maybe about 25 members. They like to keep that close to the chest. They don't want to, open up that gang to be too large because then you have the ability for people to come in who can't be trusted. And then we talk about the attraction to gangs. So really it's this cohesive unifying principle that the gang has that others buy into. They have really a shared sense of purpose. They will dress similarly or have a certain insignia that represents the gang. And a lot of them are really fearless, proud, and in control of their lives, or they feel like they are. So how do our gangs actually form? Well, the first notion is that gangs form is just a normal part of growing up. So that joining a gang is part of the experience of adolescence that they need to grow into adulthood. You also have this idea of strain theory, where juveniles will pursue gangs to achieve the success that they can't achieve through legitimate means. Or your subcultural affiliation and strain theory, so that gang delinquency really represents a subculture and a collective solution to problems that are faced specifically by lower class boys who are unable to achieve the status, who are unable to achieve the things that they feel like they should be achieving. Usually just have then subculture affiliation by itself, where there is a definite lower class culture and gang behavior is simply an expression of that lower class culture. Or you have social disorganization, which says that violent delinquent gangs really arise out of certain conditions, typically found in urban areas that are impoverished. And then the underclass theory, which is just that these individuals have been excluded from participation in labor market jobs, and members of the underclass are then attracted to other economic alternatives to achieve money, such as the gangs. Now, types of urban gangs. We're going to talk about a few different types of urban gangs in a couple different ways that they've been organized by different researchers. So Carl S. Taylor studied gangs in Detroit and came up with this model of the scavenger, territorial, and corporate gang. Scavengers simply preyed on those who were unable to defend themselves, while those who were in territorial gangs really defined an area and then claimed ownership of that area. You then had your corporate gangs, who really were more organized groups, and the main purpose of those was to make money, typically through illegal means. You then had Huff, who did studies of gangs in Cleveland and Columbus, Ohio, and he came up with these three: the hedonistic, instrumental, and predatory. The hedonistic, really their goal was simply to get high and have a good time, just to party. You had instrumental gangs, where again, their main goal is economic gain, whether that's through property crimes or that's through selling and using drugs. And then your predatory gangs, which are the ones committing your street crimes, your opportunistic crimes, your robberies, your street muggings. And they would typically use crack cocaine and also sold drugs so that they could buy more sophisticated weapons to engage in these predatory behaviors. You then had Fagan, who did research in 3 different cities and labeled 4 different types of urban gangs. Type 1, they were just involved in minor delinquent activities and some drug use. The next group got heavily involved in drug sales, took it one step farther. The next group had involvement in serious and non-serious offenses, not necessarily just drugs, but also person, property. And then type 4 really involved extensive involvement in drug use and sales, and really serious and non-serious offending, so combining all of that together. Now, how are our urban gangs organized? Well, typically you have the leadership styles of being either vertical or hierarchical, horizontal or commission, and influential. So your vertical or hierarchical are going to be your power and authority being related to simply one's position in that line of command. Horizontal is where the leaders share duties, powers, and authority across the gang. And influential is really where you just have the authority of a leader being derived from their charisma that they have, which is seen a lot more in youth gangs. It's really just a popular kid that's able to get everybody to follow him. They recruit through either threats or coercion, but also just throwing parties and showing this glamorous lifestyle that people would want to join. Or they're also through migration, where you have this establishment of sort of satellite gangs, or you have the relocation of gang members with their families, which makes an urban gang sprout up then in that neighborhood, or through the expansion of drug markets. So by way of trying to make more money off of their drug sales, they can try and expand their drug market. And then different methods of initiation here. We have being blessed in, which your book describes all of these in more detail. But being blessed in is just you have a family member who's in the gang, so you're able to be blessed into that gang as well. Jumped in, you essentially have to be physically assaulted by other members of the gang to get in. And all the way up to and including drive-by or walk-up shootings, and blood in, where it's a gang assigned murder. They tell you who you're going to take out. So a lot of different ways to be initiated into a gang. Talking about female gang members specifically, a lot of female gangs can be extremely violent, and a lot of them then participate in violent and drug-related gang activities. But females join gangs for other reasons. They tend to join it for the warmth, friends, loyalty, and socialization that they get. And they tend to receive more emotional fulfillment out of being involved in that gang. So they're really going back to the way that girls and boys socialize differently into their gender roles, really going back to that idea of how important relationships are for females as opposed to males, typically. They also tend to commit crimes at only a slightly lower rate than boys do in gangs. And they're more heavily involved in drug dealing, property crimes, and again, those status offenses that we keep seeing pop up for females. They are at a higher risk of victimization, but luckily they do tend to actually age out earlier than boys do, possibly due to the maturity level of females increasing at a higher rate than males. When we consider emergent gangs, juveniles actually make up about 90% of our emergent gangs, and they do tend to be involved in a greater level of delinquent activity, and it goes through 7 stages. So the implementation stage is where a gang leader is going to really go into a low-income minority neighborhood and recruit youth to sell drugs such as crack cocaine with a promise of giving them a certain percentage of that money. You then have expansion and conflict. So now the youth now identifies with that gang and they're wearing the proper clothes, they represent the gang, and you're going to see some fights starting to break out in the schools and weapons might be being used here. So you're seeing conflict. You then have organization and consolidation. So now organization of the gang is really developing and membership is increasing. Then that leadership is going to be really assumed by an initial core group and typically of young adults within that community. So they're really starting to take formation. You then have the gang intimidation and the community reaction to that. So there's now a competition between rival gangs that's going to erupt into sort of open conflict at schools, maybe at athletic events and shopping centers. Drugs are now starting to be sold in the schools, and the community's realizing, wow, this is happening and we need to do something about this. You then have expansion of the drug markets. So drugs are now really being openly sold in schools, on street corners, and in the shopping centers. Gangs are being led by adults who are going to stay in the community, and that organizational structure really just continues to grow. And then the gang takes over. So at this point, the gangs are really in clear control of the minority neighborhoods, and you're seeing crimes increase. And unfortunately, the ultimate result is community deterioration and deterioration of that city as a result of the gang taking full control of that. So then how do we prevent and control gangs? Well, there's been two strategies that were effective: the High Point in North Carolina and Summer Night Lights program in Los Angeles. So the High Point in North Carolina really just targeted the most violent offenders for prosecution, and they threatened lower level drug offenders with some punishments to really try and get them out of the gang. They also focused on job training and mentoring programs for those who were willing to change. So giving them that opportunity to maybe lessen that strain they're experiencing and giving them legitimate means to achieve those goals that they have for themselves. And they saw violent crime actually drop 57%. Looking at the Summer Night Lights program in Los Angeles, they really just kept the lights on in potentially dangerous parks at night to try and prevent crime from occurring in that area. So they offered recreational and artistic and educational programming as well for the youth to give them outlets, and they saw gang violence decrease by 40%. So some of these efforts seem pretty simple to be able to employ in the cities, but it just takes a group of people getting together and trying to make a difference and just trying something. So there are 5 strategies for gang intervention. The first is community organization. So this includes the community mobilizing and networking together to try and intervene in gang activity. You have social intervention, so focusing on the individual's behavior and really their changing their values. Also opportunity provision, so emphasizing improvement of education, training, job opportunities for youth, giving them those opportunities that they don't have to go seek them out through a gang. And then suppression, you do just have to focus on arrest and incarceration and monitoring and supervising the gang members to try and suppress that gang activity. And lastly, it's the organizational development and change. So creating special organizational units and procedures to really fully address this gang issue. So when we talk about a gang prevention and control model, it must include these components, according to research by Spergel and colleagues, that the community must take responsibility for developing and implementing that program, that the structural model needs to take seriously the hopelessness that comes from the unmet needs of youth coming from the underclass, that prevention programs have to be emphasized before youth even get into these gangs, that those people that the supporting model must coordinate all gang intervention efforts within that community. And there needs to be sufficient financial resources available to really do what needs to be done and get the proper services and programming within that community. So in sum, 1920s gangs really started out as transitory gangs. The 1950s urban gang youth began fighting over turf areas. And then by the 1960s, we saw super gangs developing. From the 1970s to the 90s, urban gangs started to take over, and this was by adults characterized by drug trafficking and violence. Then in the 2000s, we saw a decrease in some gangs, but growth in ethnic gangs. Juvenile gangs did become sort of a quasi-family who hangs out and commits crimes together. They increased their use of gun violence and street gangs with adult leaders, and drug trafficking really appealing to the poverty-stricken urban neighborhoods. There are these different types of gangs based on the different researchers. You have your 3 groups. And there are 7 stages to emergent gang development. First, the gang, you have implementation. You then have expansion and conflict, leading into organization and consolidation of the gang. The gang then starts to really be intimidating within the community and affects a community reaction. They then start to expand their drug market, and eventually the gang takes over and really deteriorates the community. So grassroots community programs have shown reductions in gang violence, like High Point and Night Lights, in gang violence and activity, but gang reduction really depends on providing at-risk youth with positive activities related to education, vocation, employment, and recreation, so they can achieve those goals through legitimate means and that they don't have that strain of the underclass being pressed down upon them. So this was your chapter 13 lecture on juvenile gangs. I hope everyone has just a wonderful week.